Hello, Michael here with another How Do I Render tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about rendering dark skin. And before I jump into Renderman, I'm just going to go over some of the basic techniques I use to paint the mesh in 3D Coat. So as you'll see, here I've already got the mesh imported into 3D Coat. This one's at about 200,000 polys. It has the same UV maps as the base mesh though, so I can paint on this and then apply this texture map to the low poly base mesh and still get the same result on topology. So when you import it, this is what you'll get in the scene. The first thing you want to do is make sure you delete the layer that's imported with it, otherwise that can get everything a little bit jacked up. And then we're just going to go ahead and drop in a base color for our skin. So on that layer 1 we're going to change that to be called base, and we're just going to go to our color selector, and we're going to go for a dark brown because, like I said, we're doing dark skin tones, so we don't want to do anything too saturated, but we want to make sure that we get a fairly reasonably believable color that's easy to work with. Alright, so with that selected and the paint tool selected, if you right click on the base, make sure that you've got specularity and height off, just by clicking them on and off. And we do want to make sure that our color is set to 100% opacity. Then right click and fill the whole layer, and you'll get that. So that doesn't look too bad. It's possibly a little bit low on the saturation side, so I'm just going to pull that saturation up just a touch and refill it. Alright, that looks pretty good. So let's start working in some details. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'll show you how to do the lips first, because they're pretty straightforward. There's a bit of technique to it, but I'll show you how you get started. So you definitely want this on a separate layer for reasons that you'll understand shortly. And I'm going to go to a sort of semi-saturated, mostly red color. I'm going to use a soft brush, which you can select from the alphas, and I'm just using the default alphas. And I'm almost Cintiq, so which is why the screen size is a little bit funny. But this will help me paint in with pressure sensitivity, which is super useful. And obviously just make sure that you keep inside the ellipse. And I've got the opacity set to 100%, and you're probably looking at this thinking this is a bit too pink, and I'm inclined to agree actually. I might just go a bit more on the red and darken it a touch. That's a bit better. Now this is still way too pink. It looks like lipstick at the moment for a male character. That's probably not what you're going for most of the time. So the thing with that is I'm actually wanting to do something that's a bit more saturated than what I'm going to end up with, because what I'm going to do is reduce the opacity on this layer once I've painted it all in. And I'm also going to make sure that the colour on the top lip is a little bit darker than the colour on the lower lip, because just with the way light works, when you're lighting a model, generally the upper lip will be a little bit darker. Even though if that's not physically realistic most of the time, it's still useful to do it that way. I'm going to go to a softer brush again for the lower lip here, so I can just blend out the lips to where it sort of starts to join the face. And it's useful to have reference open while you're doing this, which I always recommend. I don't have any reference open at the moment. I'm just doing this from memory, so if it looks a little bit off base, that's probably why, but it will do for this tutorial. And actually what I should have had on was, I should have symmetry on the x-axis, but that's fine. That's mostly symmetrical anyway. That would have saved a lot of time. I just forgot that I needed to do that. Alright, so with the lips painted in with their lovely pink colour, I'm going to go switch to a darker, more orangey red. I'm just going to sort of paint in the occluded areas of the lips, which is which is the darker areas where the lips join. And I don't want this edge to be too hard, but try and get it pretty dark in there. And I'm not painting necessarily where there is typology for the creases in the skin. Some of this is just implied, but it is sort of useful to help the texture quality of your renders to paint in some of those dark areas manually, even if there isn't actually topology there. Generally it's going to make your model look a little bit better. And because I'm rushing this, it may not be my best work, so just so you're aware. So yeah, that's pretty good, and I want to make sure that I'm overdoing this quite a lot, because I'm going to be reducing the opacity on this layer. Now we're going to do the highlights, so I'm just going to go back to a less saturated orangey sort of colour. And the highlights are just going to be mostly on this lower lip here, sort of across the centre. This is sort of where you'd see the specularity of the lip. And also just a touch, just very gently on the top of the top lip as well, just where the lip folds over a little bit to meet the skin area above the front teeth. Alright. And I'm just going to colour pick this top layer and then go slightly darker. And then just paint that in again, just to make sure it's a little bit darker than the lower lip. Alright, so that doesn't look right, obviously. But with the saturation as it is, if we just go back on the opacity, we can get it to sort of look a little bit more realistic. I should probably have pushed this a little bit more towards orange, just looking at it now, but it's not too bad. Still probably a bit on the red side, but I'm going to roll with it. Yeah, that's about right. So about 40% opacity, that's pretty much going to do the trick. Now the reason working down from saturation is easier is when you try to increase the saturation on colour, it tends to blow out the colour in particular areas, so it's easier to soften it rather than make it more saturated. So with the lips complete, or as complete as they're going to be for now, let's jump in and do some skin complexion on a new layer. So this is going to be where the skin tones vary. I'm just going to try and find sort of a lighter part of the skin and then make it just a touch saturated. And just a touch lighter and saturated. So this is going to be sort of the forehead, the top of the nose, tip of the nose. You don't want to do this too much with a dark skin tone. Complexion is a lot more subtle than you would have with a fair skin tone. So a lot of this is just going to be for variance, and if you wanted to vary it up even more, you could use a different type of alpha, but just for this basic tutorial I'm just going to be using this soft brush. So the top of the lips a little bit there as well, the cheekbone, under the eyes, definitely the top of the nose and the tip of the nose and the little lobes on the side there. And I'm just going to turn, especially with 3D coat, something you want to keep in mind is the light intensity. Try and keep it at 100 if you can. It will help keep your color values a little bit more even. If you blow it out too much, you might sort of overcompensate. I'm just going to do it sort of around there, and the chin's another important area. Just going to do a couple of layers across the top there, and I'm not going to focus too much on the back of the head, because if you remember this model from one of my other tutorials, it's not very realistic. Just for the hell of it, let's just make it a bit lighter overall. We'll make the subsurface scattering look a little bit more interesting. And the ears, so I'm going to go to a more saturated red now, because I want to help the subsurface scatter in the airs a little bit more. So the areas which are going to have more scattering, I'm going to paint red just a touch, just blending it in lightly. So that's going to be that part of the air, the back of the lobe, the lower lobe there. That's probably a bit much. Okay, I'm just going to colour pick the lighter skin tone again. When you're colour picking, don't rely on it 100%, because you end up getting kind of a muddy result. Just going to paint in those lighter parts of the air there, where it'd be picking up some reflection. And the inner part of the ear and the nose I'll do on the complexion layer as well, so just a dark colour, just softly coming out. And inside the nose there as well. Try and make sure you don't have too much of an edge, otherwise it's going to be pretty obvious when you go to render it. Alright, and finally I'm just going to paint in some real basic occlusion, which is just going to help the detail in the darker shadow areas. So I'm going to use that same dark colour, soft brush again, because we don't want to see too hard lines. I'm just going to gently get in those tight areas. That's probably a little bit hard a line. It can be difficult with those really small areas to paint it accurately. That's not amazing, but it will do. If you hold down shift, you can blend it a little bit as you draw over the top. And I'm also going to do sort of on the top of the eye. It's very soft. And just some of those creases. Alright, and we can just quickly do some detail around the ear as well. And the underside of the cheekbone as well. Okay. Alright. So the lips saturation, just looking at it, still probably looks a little bit high, and I'm probably going to lose too much of the colour, honestly. But I think I'm going to roll with it roughly there. Just get the light turned around facing it. It probably won't be too bad once we get into Renderman, but it's not amazing. But my technique still stands. I think working from a saturated colour backwards is a good way to do it, because you get that good blend between the colour of the lips and the colour of the skin, which is sort of what you want to get a sort of fairly realistic lip shade. But for the sake of me painting this model in 10 minutes for this tutorial, this is going to pretty much do it. Sort of other things that you might want to consider doing would be probably a little bit more detail on the lips, any complexion that you'd want to do for like moles or hair, like you could paint in like a bit of stubble and things like that. But for this model I'm going to keep it pretty simple because it's fairly stylized. So yeah, so now we're going to go, oh actually there's one more thing that we can do. We're going to do a layer above everything. I'm just going to move that up. And this is going to be called Spec, which is for specularity. And I'm going to paint some specularity onto the lips, and then we can use this as a specularity layer in Maya. So we're just going to turn on gloss, going to turn off color, and make sure that the opacity is 100, and the gloss intensity is 100, and then we can turn off that symmetry plane. There we go. Alright, so this is going to look pretty dumb, but we can reduce it once we get into Renderman. I'm not 100% certain why this is, but for some reason the alphas don't tend to work at all on when you're painting in specularity. I don't know why that is. I'm sure there's a good reason for it. So the edge is going to be a little bit hard on those lips for the specularity, but because it's out on it's going to export on a separate layer to the color, it's not going to be a big issue to sort of increase the roughness, and the color won't matter. So let's go File, Export Objects and Textures. We're not exporting geometry, but we still need to change the output mesh name. I'm going to export this to the project file, which I've already created. This is going to be called Dark Skin. Okay, so if you select PBR Specular, we can export the specular layer and the gloss layer. We don't need the normal map, we don't need the bump or the AO, because there is no AO. No generated AO, that is. So just the diffuse, specular and gloss, and I can't remember which one of those two we're going to use. I'm pretty sure it's specular, but I'm just going to export the gloss as well. If you were exporting the mesh, you'd probably want to export the low poly mesh if you'd already created displacements and normals, which I have. I'm not actually exporting the geometry, but you do need to name it. And then we can press OK and it'll export. Alright. And also these maps are at 2K, just so you know, for the sake of reference. Alright, so let's now jump over into Maya and connect everything up. Okay, so in Maya here, you'll see I've imported the model. I've also imported the eyes and added a texture map to those already, because I didn't want to have to do that while on video. I've set up two lights, and I haven't assigned the shader to our guy yet, so let's do that. One of the things I've already done is I've added subdivision to him. If you don't know about this, you want to check out my normal map tutorial or displacement map tutorial, because I will be using a normal map. I'm not going to bother with the displacement on this particular example though. So select your mesh, go click the little ball icon, that's the Pixar surface, and then they'll create that. We're going to call this Pixar skin, and then we're going to import our color by clicking the checker box and then File and then Open, and then we go to where you exported your source, your images to, and then dark skin diffuse is going to be our color map. And I'm also going to connect a normal map. Alright, so let's just do a quick render. Whoops, I got plugged into the gain. I want that plugged into the color. Diffuse color, sorry, not into the gain. You want the gain set to 1.0 as well, or 100%. And then you'll see that we've got our texture map applied to our guy. So let's run a quick IPR and see how he looks. Okay, so with the lighting on him, just with the diffuse, you'll see that he doesn't look too bad. But we're still getting all of the things that we painted in, which are the nose there. One thing to note actually is something I missed when I was painting is where the symmetry line is. I didn't get close enough to it, which has created sort of a little bit of a line there on the nose, so which is not ideal, but it'll do for now. And because I've got the normal map applied to the subdivision scheme, that is why we're getting a much smoother mesh than our low poly model. Alright, but let's get some subsurface scattering happen. So I have to stop the IPR before we can do that, otherwise it won't work correctly. So back in the Hypershade editor, we're going to connect our skin tone to our subsurface color. So if we just drag that out to subsurface color, that's going to be connected. Then we'll go back to our shader. We'll go down to subsurface. So we're going to use the de-embedded dipole, like I did in one of my previous tutorials, and we're going to increase the gain. And then we're going to change the mean free path color by selecting the color, and we're going to pull it around to, let's just make sure it's 100% saturated, and the value is 100, so it's right at that bottom right corner. This is going to be pulled a little bit, sort of almost just fractionally on the pink, and then I'm going to pull the darkness up just a touch. Alright, that should pretty much do it. And then if we run an IPR again, you'll see that we're getting the subsurface scattering. Now at the moment it's a bit too heavy, so we're going to just control this with the attribute editor. We're going to go back to that subsurface. Okay, and we're going to reduce the mean free path distance somewhat. So this is just going to be the depth in which it scatters, which will make it look a little bit more like skin, because skin doesn't distribute light doesn't enter the skin that deep and scatter. So at a value of 1, we're not looking too bad if you pay attention to what's happening with the air here. So that's a really good spot to measure your subsurface scattering. So it's looking pretty realistic actually right now, because generally with a hard light right behind the model, and this light behind the model is I think at 25 in intensity, we're going to get a fairly good amount of scattering happening through the nose, and you can see just a touch of scattering happening on the side of his neck there as well. So that's pretty much it really. If you don't have the diffuse on, I'd just like to point out everything starts to lose a bit of detail, and because the skin has got has a diffuse nature to it, you do generally want to have diffuse mixed in. It will balance out any other lobes that are active. Alright, and finally we're going to attach the specular to the ellipse. So we're just going to go back into the hypershade editor, and then we're going to select the shader and go down to clear coat, and then we're going to go to the face color, select the checkerboard, go file, open, and select the the gloss, and click open. And then if you render, you'll see that the specularity has been applied to the ellipse, but you'll notice it's a bit too specular and it's probably a bit too sharp. We could probably use to make that a bit rougher. So let's go back to the clear coat, and we can probably increase the roughness to 0.4. And now the only other thing is that it looks like it's a bit too specular. Because we've got it plugged into the face color, because it's sort of acting as a mask, we can't actually adjust the brightness of the map using the lobe. But if we go to the file that's plugged into it in the hypershade editor, and then go to the color game, we can reduce it. I'll just show you what's happening till we get it to a point where we're happy. So I'm just going to make this quite subtle. And finally we can add some overall specular to our model, because the skin does have a slight specular nature to it. So we'll go to the face color, select the color, and then we'll type in 0.003 in the value, and then click done. And you'll see that that's added a bit of specularity. It's a bit too much at the moment, or rather it's a bit sharp, so we could just increase the roughness till we're happy. So at about 0.45, that's looking pretty good. It's probably a little bit waxy, but you can sort of play around with the face color of the value to get it to exactly where you want it. But yeah, if I rotate this around a little bit, you'll see that looks pretty good all over, fairly realistic or fairly believable. We're getting a nice bit of reflection on the lips as well as on the rest of the model, as well as our subsurface scattering. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. I hope you liked the tutorial. Sorry I was a bit quick on the texturing end of it. I just wanted to run through that very quickly for those of you who are creating custom textures. If you like the video, make sure you click like so others can find it, and let me know in the comments as well. That really helps me out. If you've got anything that you'd like me to add or change, or if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, make sure you're subscribed, because I'm uploading 2 tutorials a week at the moment for all sorts of CG stuff. So if that's what you're into, make sure you're hanging about. That's pretty much it for now though. Thank you very much for watching, and happy rendering.